Hi team, and welcome to this World of Medics video. Today we're going to be looking at cell biology and specifically a part of the cell called the mitochondria. Let's get stuck in. So the mitochondria, we can think of them as being essentially the engine of the cell. So let's write that down, the engine of the cell. And the same way an engine is responsible for essentially producing energy within a car, the mitochondria have the same function. So they are the powerhouses of the cell. And if we remember, ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is the energy source used within the body, and this is usually produced by aerobic respiration. So ATP is produced by aerobic respiration, which basically means that respiration takes place using oxygen when oxygen is abundant within the body. And so for that reason, the mitochondria are usually positioned where oxygen enters the cell or where ATP is used by the cell. It's a tactical maneuver, you could say, by the mitochondria. In terms of the number of the mitochondria, they can vary largely depending on the type of tissue and the type of cell that the mitochondria is in. And this is largely dependent on the activity of the tissue. So the number depends on the activity level of the tissue. And this can range anywhere from 100 mitochondria in a cell to multiple thousands of mitochondria. So the more active a cell is, the more mitochondria it's going to have, because the more ATP is required by the cell. So examples of tissues where there might be a lot of mitochondria include muscles, liver, and kidney tubules, for example. In cardiac myocytes, anywhere up to about 30% of the total cell volume can be composed of mitochondria. So you can see exactly how important these cell organelles are. Now we've got a diagram of a mitochondria here, and we can see that it's long and thin, but actually there's quite a lot of variation in shape. They can also be short and fat. So that's something just to note. And the genes, the mitochondrial genes, they are different in inheritance compared to other somatic cells. So mitochondrial genes are inherited from the mother. And there's a very interesting reason for that. So when a sperm cell, if we take another color and we draw an oocyte, so this is in the mother and the sperm cell is over here, okay, so it kind of looks like a bit like a tadpole. And we can see from this diagram that it's only the head of the sperm cell which is penetrating and fertilizing the oocyte. And this part of the sperm cell doesn't contain many organelles at all. In fact, it doesn't contain any mitochondria. So for this reason, the mitochondrial genes are inherited from the mother. And even if mitochondria happen to enter the oocyte somehow, they are quickly destroyed, so they don't actually come from the father at all, the genes for the mitochondria. Okay, so now we've got some basic information on the mitochondria on lock, guys. So let's look a bit more in detail at the structure of the mitochondria. So mitochondrial structure. And again, we like to break things down in World of Medics. So let's imagine a simple long bean, okay? And this bean has two outer layers, and we're going to start from the outside of the bean, or the mitochondria. So the outer layer is very simply called the outer mitochondrial membrane. And this is composed of proteins called porins. So let's take another color and we'll write that down. So it's got proteins called porins. And that's something that I want you guys to remember. So these porins, what they do is they form channels, allowing small molecules to pass through into the mitochondria. And these channels act, you could say the outer membrane acts like a sieve. So it only allows small molecules to enter the mitochondria and leaves the large molecules outside the mitochondria. And then inside the outer mitochondrial membrane, we simply have something called the, that's right, you guessed it, the inner mitochondrial membrane. And you can probably see from this diagram that there is actually a very small space in between both of these membranes. And that space is simply filled with fluid. Both of these membranes, the outer mitochondrial membrane and the inner mitochondrial membrane, they are very similar in structure to the plasma membrane, and we'll come on to that in another video. So, we're on to the inner mitochondrial membrane, and when we look at the diagram here, we can see that there's multiple folds inside the inner mitochondrial membrane. It's creating this strange sort of maze structure within it. And there's an interesting reason as to why this is. So let's zoom in a little bit and look at this, okay? So these folds, they are called cristae. Cristae, okay? And these folds, the reason for them is to create a larger surface area for the chemical processes to take place for respiration, aerobic respiration, and the production of ATP. Because the more surface area there is, the more chemical reactions and the more enzymes can work, and the more ATP can be produced. Okay, simple as that. Now, what about this inner space that the inner mitochondrial membrane is housing? That's called the matrix. And this simply contains enzymes, it contains ribosomes, which, if we remember, ribosomes are responsible for producing or synthesizing proteins. And again, this happens when, for example, the mitochondrial membrane, the mitochondria want to divide if the cell is undergoing and requires large amounts of energy production. So the matrix, we'll say, it's got enzymes and it has ribosomes, amongst other things. It also has some DNA as well. Cool. So that's the basic structure of the mitochondria. And let's just recap briefly how the mitochondria produce energy. So we're going to draw a big circle around it and pretend this mitochondria is in a cell. And the human body produces energy from a basic structural component called, well, a sugar component called glucose. So glucose. And glucose enters a cell and is converted into pyruvate. Pyruvate. And this happens within the cytoplasm. Now this process, called glycolysis, so this is called glycolysis, releases a very small amount of ATP. And this process, it doesn't require any oxygen, so it's an anaerobic process. Now the part that requires oxygen is when pyruvate enters the mitochondria and then undergoes further reactions, including something called the Krebs cycle, and then produces carbon dioxide and water. And this process creates a lot of ATP. ATP plus plus plus. So this part produces the most ATP, and this is why mitochondria are so important within the human cell. So there you go. That's a quick overview on mitochondria.